Morning.
Well, hi everyone. We can go ahead and get started since this is only a 1-hour session and I see like some people are trickling in. Corinn and I will be your moderators today, and we're really excited to host this session on how to obtain funding, which is super important if you want to excel in your career, especially in academia. That has been one of the biggest competitions, is how much money you have. It controls whether you get a job after you graduate or what position you can sort of negotiate for. So we have a really excellent panel today. I'll start with 2 of the introductions and I'll let Corinn do the 2 others. So our first introduction is Dr. George Perry, if you don't mind giving a little wave. He's a professor and distinguished university chair in neurobiology at University of Texas, San Diego. And I'm a Texan, so I'm really excited to have some more Texas representation here. And Dr. Elaine is a professor at New Mexico University, but as she mentioned, she also spends a lot of time at other institutions, including some in California. So we have these 2 senior faculty will be able to help us navigate funding. And I'll hand it over to Corinn to introduce our other 2.
Yeah, thank you, Beck. We have 2 other great panelists here today. We have Dr. Daisy Hsu, instructor at Harvard Medical School. And then we also have Staci Weaver, who is a PhD candidate at Indiana University School of Medicine.
So we have a good breadth of dynamic positions that you can have in academia and how important funding is at all levels. Before we get started, just some quick housekeeping. I think we can take screenshots of the group. If you don't want to be included, please turn your camera off. Or if you want to turn your camera on and just type in the chat, like, don't post photos of me, like, we want to be respectful. But also social media has been a big part of being a scientist. So, that's something to keep in mind. If you have any questions that you don't feel comfortable asking yourself, please type them in the chat. Corinn and I will be navigating the chat and asking them for you. However, we would really like this to be a conversation. So if you don't mind unmuting yourself or turning on your camera and unmuting yourself and using the raise hand feature to ask your question, we will also be keeping tabs on that. So to get started, I guess, there's a ton of different grant types you can get. In undergrad, you could do summer research grants. There's even some undergrad scholarships for just performing research throughout all 4 years. And you don't have to be in science to do that. You could do scientific research and still be a liberal arts major, which is really nice. It helps kind of widen your training. There's graduate fellowships, including NIH-funded ones, and transition fellowships like the F99 KOO. And there's also nonprofit and foundation fellowships that you can apply to. For postdocs, you also have NIH. You have institutional grants like Iraq does, or T32s. And there's also company, pharmaceutical, nonprofit foundation grants. So as you go on in your training, it seems like the type of grants you can get, the options grow wider. So for my first question, which sort of appeals to an audience that I have noticed tends to ask this question in other sessions I've been in, is, are there any grants for international students that are in master's or doctoral programs? And any of the panelists, feel free to win.
This is something I've just had an international student join my lab from Africa, Nigeria, and to think of what grants he would be eligible for as a pre-doc. Postdoc, I know there are grants, but as pre-doc, I haven't figured that out yet. And he's not a green card holder or any of those things. Maybe if Elaine can help inform me, she'll send a bottle of wine or something.
Oh, good. I like wine. I actually, there was, and I don't know if it's still there, but I know they're thinking about reinstating it. A section at National Science Foundation for Hispanic speaking, it wasn't for African, but it was here in New Mexico. We like to recruit people from Central and South America. And there is money through the National Science Foundation. I had a collaborative grant through NSF I teamed up with a scientist at Cuernavaca and UNAM, and he and I wrote this little National Science Foundation grant, and we shared graduate students that came back and forth between Cuernavaca and Mexico. So there, and they were paid, they were supported by NSF. These are, I need to throw into that long list that Vic gave you. There are two kind of types, maybe let's say three types of grants that students and postdocs can qualify for. Some of them are intramural. Your institution makes these scholarships available. And those are usually the ones you get when you're an undergrad. There's not a lot of extramural funding for undergrad research, although if you're at one of those universities that qualify for undergraduate only funding, there are NSF funds for those, but they go to the institution and you have to apply within your institution to get that money. Then the second bin, I would say, is these training grants, like they're called T32s, T31s, ARACTA. These are grants that come from NIH to your institution, and your institution picks who is going to get that money. So those are training grants, but you don't apply to the federal for that money. You have to apply to the program in your institution. And then there are fellowships that you can apply for that the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation offer. And I'm right now teaching a course to our graduate students that I do every year. They don't all take it. We want to make it, they want to make it obligatory, but I don't want to make it obligatory because I want to make it hard and I want kids to want to be there. But at any rate, we talk about these federal funding, and those are independent grants that you apply as a student to the federal funding agency. Those are the ones that really give you power for your future, because those are ones that you earn competitively nationally. The ones you get within your institution, you're competing with other students in your institution. But if you're at someplace by University of New Mexico, that competition is not considered to be very intense. Whereas if you have to compete nationally, you're competing with students at Harvard, you're competing with students at UCSF. And so that competition is considered to be more intense. And if you succeed in that arena, then you have a much bigger gold star. So there are ways to get funding in California, and I think in Texas, George, and you can fill me in, there are a lot of private foundation funding opportunities for students and postdocs. And my first solo through the Bank of America in California. So those scholarships, fellowships are not available in New Mexico. Those are just for students in California institutions. I think they have those in New York State and Massachusetts and probably in Texas, although I don't know.
What we have, and it's throughout the country, but it wouldn't be for international students, is the Mark Rice program. And that includes undergraduates and graduate students. That theoretically it's focused on minorities, but it's basically focused on disadvantaged students. And I know some of the UC campuses, Irvine had one for a while, and I think some other campuses have had them. They're competitively awarded to the institution, not to the individual.
Thank you. Daisy and Staci, would you guys like to weigh in on that first question?
Yeah, I'm an international postdoc, so I would say that yeah, it is more like apparent to have grant funding opportunities after you've completed your PhD, because I did my PhD back in Australia, and there were a handful of international PhD students at the time when I was going through, and it was a big struggle for them. They do get scholarship opportunities, and it was intramural, so the University of Sydney was providing it, and sometimes their host country would provide it as well. But the thing is, these scholarships was very strict, so they weren't a tight deadline, so they had to complete their PhD within 3 years, And if not, then they would have to basically self-fund. So yeah, it is quite a challenge, and there definitely needs to be more flexibility with these scholarships. But yeah, there's not that many opportunities out there. It's definitely more for postdocs. So it may be easier to do your PhD in your host country without any of those restrictions, and then take on the international career as a postdoc, because you will get those funding options.
And Elaine was mentioning about specific cases. So like in the University of Texas, there's an exchange program with Mexico that includes supporting students. And I think the University of California has a similar program, but it's very focused. It's a National Science Foundation of Mexico with the University of Texas, and it funds investigators, postdocs, and pre-docs.
Yeah, one thing I would add is just in my experience, this is one of probably the most significant disparities between people that hold the citizenship and people who don't, and how highly regarded funding is. And so when I worked with international students, really the only options that I've seen and have been successful are for grants that are through private funding agencies or nonprofit institutions. And some of those are nationally. So I do type 1 diabetes research, and Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation has some reward or some grants and different RFAs they put out. And I believe most of them, anyone can apply. But unless it's through like anything other than the government, the options are unfortunately really limited.
I have heard that senior international students 2 to 3 years from graduating can apply for the F99 KOO. It's a transition to postdoc. So, but that also means that they're favoring people that will go into postdocs. So if someone is interested in industry or some sort of alternative career, the options are definitely less. Thank you so much to our panelists. If you have any questions, please use the raise hand feature or type it in the chat. If not, I can go ahead and ask another question. Do you need to address your undergraduate grades in grant applications as a doctoral student? I know that with the F31, they want you to comment on it. And I guess I'm curious to know, for those that have been through it, either as a mentor or as a mentee, how did y'all address it?
Oh, I can comment on my recent F31 application. So I'm a non-traditional student, so I was like filling out the bio sketch kind of how I normally would, but I didn't realize that you have to have a whole page of all of your grades from like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year, and all of that is heavily listed out. And I think you get maybe one line to maybe say any other detail, like maybe you went somewhere that wasn't on a 4.0 scale or something like that. You can add like a little detail, but you do have to very clearly spell that out and write your grades. So it is definitely needed. And I don't remember talking too much about that in the narrative anywhere, but just on the end page of the bio sketch is all of your grades.
Yeah, I'm probably the most familiar with this with reviewing NSF pre-doc grants, and grades are one of the considerations, but they're certainly not the overwhelming consideration. Maybe the water walking is the main one because they're so competitive. But most of the people have exceptional grades, but it's not a major consideration.
I've reviewed for the NIH training grants, and I've had students apply, and I've had a couple students get them, but not many. And I've advised students that if they have some real terrible grades in some odd area, that they do need to defend that, and they don't do it in the, you can do it sort of in the bio sketch, but you also get a statement in the application, like who you are and where you're going. And you can also talk to your sponsors, and they can give your excuses or your justification for having dropped a C somewhere or dropped a course somewhere. And you really need to do that, because when you sit in the study section and all the reviewers are discussing it, some stupid reviewer will come up, look at that grade in their sophomore year in English literature or in something, history of China or something that isn't relevant to your science work at all. And you have to put a really positive spin on it. So you have to think, you can't say, oh, my dog ate my homework that year. You have to put a really positive spin. This course just didn't catch my imagination while science was distracting me and I was spending too much time in the lab, or something that makes them think, that it was your commitment to science that messed you up. Something positive about why you dropped a grade. But I think it's really sad that this history of evaluations tracks along for years, and that at the very beginning of your career, very beginning of your education, you have to pay attention to your grades. When I was a professor at Brown, we would counsel students to drop any class they couldn't ace.
Wow.
Yeah. To add to that, from an international perspective, we don't have GPAs. So at least where I went, some universities in Australia have taken on the GPA concept, but ours is really interesting. It's like a percentage out of 100. And so you can have a high distinction if you have over 85, distinction for 75, credit for 75, distinction for 75, credit for 65, passes 50. So ours, we'd have to have a statement explaining what all those numbers mean. So from an international perspective, yeah, you would have to have a paragraph explaining what all these denominations are, like what is a high distinction, because that is like an A for us, but it doesn't translate to the GPA.
Thank you all so much. That was really enlightening. I don't see it. Oh, yes, Dr. Bielenberg.
Bielenberg, that's okay. Hey, I just went a couple comments. One is, I agree with Elaine, like if it's a really bad grade and you're still in your pre-doc, I would say retake the class. But if it's like a B, that's fine. Like no one's gonna fuss over a B, like unless it's a really bad grade. So, and then this is also where I think the letters are so important. On any training grant, you're gonna have letters of recommendations from people. So you could discuss that, you know, when you know you have a bad grade, they can put that in the letter, like, oh, this person's really serious now. They might have started out immature, but they've really matured. There's many things they can say that can really help with those things. So that's what I would do. I would talk to the people writing the letters for you and like, be honest and just say, I have this is my, you know, resume, and this is the grades I got. And so I have to kind of say something about that. So they can help to do that in their letters, and that's important. So. And then one thing I just put in the chat, if no one saw, was the AHA. So they give pre-doc grants, the American Heart Association. And I know not everybody works on the vasculature, but like I've had people write that are like just sort of adjacent to the, like it's not exactly about the vasculature. And the funding percentile is like 40 percentile. So compared to like NIH, it's a lot. Like and they give a lot of grants. So they have gone down in how many times you can apply per year. Like it used to be 3 times a year, now it's just once a year. But like if you can get one of those, that can really set off your whole career, because you could get a pre-doc, you could get a postdoc, you get a PI grant, and like you could really be in the field from having these kinds of things. So, and then the last thing I just would say is, you know, I worked for someone in my PhD that had a lot of money, a lot of funding. And so he always was saying, oh, you don't need to apply. You don't need to apply because I have money, I have money. But actually that's him having money. That's my PI having money. That's me. So I made the mistake of then not applying to any grants, but then I don't have a funding history. So even if you can get a pre-doc or a postdoc grant, it shows later when you want to be a PI that you've had funding history. And that's really counts, you know, to your favor, even if it's foundations, anything. And so even if later you did change your mind and you're going to industry, or I'm going to just teach, do something else, that never goes against you. So, you know, I think I was misled early on that you don't need that because I have money, I'll take care of you. And it's easier, right? I didn't have to worry about writing a grant, but it doesn't help you if that is your career path that you want to go towards academia, then you're going to have to do it at some point. So you might as well learn in the kind of, smaller grants as a pre-doc or postdoc. It's a good training exercise to write them, even if you don't get them, even if it's disappointing not to get them. It's such a good training for you to learn, start making a bio sketch, start these kinds of things. And then, if you don't get it, you don't get it.
Well, I think the other thing about applying for these things is it gets your name and your work out, and you get feedback beyond national feedback from other scientists. You get feedback not only for your project, but you get feedback for your preparation of the proposal. You get feedback on how you're articulating your career, which you have to write some career statement in there. You get really amazing information from the reviews, and sometimes they're hard to read. So you also get the experience of reading tough criticism and learning how to manage that emotional reaction you're going to have. And it's just, applying for funding is an amazing educational experience, regardless of whether you get the money. And it does put your name into the pot of names of serious scientists in the US. And if you don't get funded this time and you reapply next time, your name goes back in there and your name becomes more and more familiar to people. And familiar names are names that get funded. So, well, you want to have positive familiarity. But
Yeah,
Thank
just
you.
on the
Oh, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to add about the mourning period of the rejection of a grant. I think that that's definitely something that we could talk about, because it is not easy to see that you didn't get the grant, and it's going to happen because of the success rates of grants. It's bound to happen, and there is just so many like super talented people that don't get the funding, which is shocking. But that's just how the system is. And so each time you apply, and if you don't get it, I think that's really helpful to get over that emotional hurdle and just take a few days for yourself to get over it and talk to people about it, because yeah, it can be really disheartening, but you got to roll with the punches here in research.
That's some really good advice. We have a question in the chat. It says, I recently submitted a F31. If it is rejected, do you recommend applying for the diversity F31 or resubmit the parent F31?
I think you'd want to comment to the program officers for these to get advice of what they recommend first. Then I don't know, Elaine may have much deeper ideas on it, but that's what I would do if I was the applicant.
I totally agree with that. The program officer, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but you should definitely talk with the program officer. So what I tell my students who are going for F30, 31, F32 is that they should first figure out what they're good at and what they want to do, and which institute does that fit best with. You have to go online and look at the mission statements of the institutes. Each of the 27 national institutes of health, each one of those has a particular person who's responsible for their training grant program. And oftentimes that person is not a PhD scientist, it's an internal administrative person with a master's degree in science. So you need to take that into consideration when you hear what they tell you. But you should definitely let them know at least 6 weeks before you're planning to submit, maybe 2 or 3 months before you submit, that you're considering it, and get some feedback from them. If you qualify for the diversity, you should absolutely go for the diversity. The hit rate is much, much better than the non-diversity grants, but the criteria are stiff and you have to qualify for it. And if you don't qualify and you submit it, your grant will be withdrawn and thrown out. And that's really painful, because then you don't even get a review, you get no feedback.
And there are always rules with regard to these things, like if you're submitting in one place and you change it to the other. That's why it's useful to know from the program officer what is the right protocol.
I guess I should say another thing. I'm going through a terrible thing with Center of Scientific Review because during the pandemic, they upgraded their instructions and they changed a lot of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And at all your institutions, you should have this Office of Sponsored Projects or some pre-award office that should be examining your grants and making sure they're compliant. And we have one at UNM. But UNM's office lost a lot of people during the pandemic. They're very short-staffed. They didn't pay attention to the new rules. And my grant that I submitted in June was withdrawn by the NIH, by Center for Scientific Review, 6 weeks before the study section was going to meet, which gave, and 2 weeks before the next grant deadline where I could turn it around and resubmit it. And the reason is that it was not compliant. And the problem was that my SPO pushes the button. So I prepare everything and then they push the button. And there's a new automatic thing within the assembly process of your PDF that adds hyperlinks to any text that it automatically recognizes. And hyperlinks are disallowed. You're not allowed to have hyperlinks. Well, my documents had no hyperlinks, but when SPO pushed the button, they activated that automatic system and hyperlinks were added throughout my grant. Now these added hyperlinks are not highlighted. The only way you can find them is by hovering your mouse over them. And if you don't know this process is happening, you can't fix it because you can't find them. So I'm in the process of talking to the top guy at Center for Scientific Review about this process. Now they might tell you, oh, nobody else's grant has been withdrawn. Well, it turns out that they're applying this unevenly. Somehow they're randomly selecting grants and auditing them for this mistake, this technical glitch in their system, and they're only withdrawing the grants that they audit. So there are grants that are going through with all these non-compliance in them and grants that are being withdrawn randomly. One of the lessons from this is that there are new instructions that come out regularly, like once a month even, and you have to be up to speed on what those instructions are before you submit your grant and make sure you don't have any technical glitches.
That's really important to review our grants very thoroughly for those kinds of.
Well, there is a link for, and we should provide this to everybody who's come to this session. There is a link for instructions for the fellowship grants that are the kinds that you guys would write. And National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease actually has a wonderful site where they post grants that have succeeded in their system. And they also post the summary statements. So you can go and see exactly what it looks like on that site. And I can send those links around to, should I send them to you, Vic? Maybe you can send them to the attendees.
Yeah, that would be great. It's just so everyone's aware, I'm taking copious notes. We're going to make a blog post on what we discussed today to post on the ASIP website, and we'll tweet about it. So keep your eyes peeled for these tips and advice, since I know it's going to be invaluable for many people. So definitely want to share the knowledge here.
I want to just further comment on my first F31, I didn't fully appreciate the level of detail of all the rules that need to be taken into account. So I literally, there's a PDF, I printed off that PDF and kept rereading it for every section because there are so many little rules. And I think half of the competition is, can you follow all the little rules? And so, and the rules aren't just in like one spot. There's like, you have to read the whole document. It's kind of organized, but it's a little bit hidden, all the rules. So
work for
really
it, right?
Yeah, I was surprised. It's intense.
And as Elaine said, it's constantly changing. The biographical sketch almost every time, every few months, it seems to change now in ways that are not very meaningful.
I think some of the
that's
ways
good.
being changed are counterproductive. And I would like our society to possibly, the policy committee, to look into some of this, because I think scientists need and applicants need to weigh in on how the NIH is implementing these weird policies. And I don't know, right now the idea is that you cannot cite web-based resources because you can't have web information in your grant. So when you're doing data mining, how do you avoid citing web-based resources? I mean, or you're posting your software on GitHub. How is that productivity monitored? I mean, it's some of the new instructions are really counterproductive in the scientific community.
Yeah, just on this topic as well, there have been grants that have been rejected for minor things like formatting as well, just not having the right margins, not having the right font size.
Yes.
And so, yeah, half of the grant, like Staci was saying, it's basically like following the rules. And if you can follow the rules, you probably will be funded.
And the only contrary is a reviewer, when you get people to go to extremely small font size to pack things in, it becomes unreadable sometimes.
I can make a comment. It's okay. So just, I think a takeaway of what a bunch of you just said is like prepare early. Like, I know that's easy to say because nobody ever has enough time, but the earlier you like start working on it and get feedback, and like to take off what Daisy said, like, especially for your resubmission, like take the days and like get over it. But then I'd say the mistakes I made earlier in my career were, I was too proud. I didn't want anyone to see that I got a bad score or wasn't funded. And I have to say, in the older days, people were really quiet about that and they didn't tell if they didn't get funded. My PI never said he didn't get funded sometimes. So I thought everybody got funded and I was like the only one. So I had a big ego and I was like, I don't want them to know I got a bad score. So I wouldn't tell, but that was like the big mistake. Like the better is like the more information. So if you can share your summary statement with other people, get feedback, like which things do you think I should really change? These two reviewers said opposite things, which one should I follow? Like the more you can get advice and have people help you edit it and make it better. Usually the one that gets funded is the best one. The review process does work, but it's hard to hear it, especially like it's your life, like you spent all your time doing this. And so sometimes you just need to actually like have less data. You said too much. And sometimes it's just, making it easier for the reviewers to read or kind of marketing your idea better. But I have found that once you can kind of swallow the pride and like show the more people, the better, and then it's going to be better. So, but it took me a long time to learn that. So, and also to get over it. One advice I heard was, I think it was actually at an ACIP panel, was write back a rebuttal, like what you really want to say day one. Well, really, like a meme, and then delete it because you got it out. And then don't send that, obviously, but you got it out. And that helps you like get over the grieving of it because you're like, well, you don't know anything. And then write the nice one back the next time, but you got it off. So I thought that was really funny. And I thought that actually might be helpful. So, but yeah, in the beginning, it's very hard to kind of hear the comments and you're like, oh. So, but usually, again, if you take a little time and step back from it, then start again. But they tend, NIH on purpose gives it your review within days of the next submission. So that you have to wait to the next cycle. So, but even for like foundations, anything, just take the same one and resubmit it to 3 places and keep trying, changing things. I know many people that have got it funded at multiple places and then they take the best offer too. So, and then since there was a comment before about the diversity one, I just want to say, no one ever knows it's diversity. So for instance, if I get one for, say, for women only or something like that, where you're from, no one ever knows that. All they know is you have funding. So you shouldn't ever feel like that's somehow some kind of a lesser award or something like that. Like if I can get one for blonde hair, I'll take it. I don't care where it got funded. I'm doing the same research. I'm just serious. Like, so I don't think you should ever feel like, that it was like a different pool of applicants. Like they're all hard to get. And however you get it, you get it. And no one ever, it's just going to say F31. It's not going to say anything else. So I think, take anything you can get. I mean, if there's, if I could get any travel award to anything, I would take it. So, and again, later on your CV, you just need these kinds of awards and things, even if it's for a poster, if it's for anything, these all just add up to your CV, so take anything.
Okay. So just to shift gears a little bit, does having a social media presence or a personal website, like a personal CV website, impact your grants or fellowships? Because as we're, entering a more internet age. I guess we've been in it for a while, but I feel like social media has been becoming such a bigger part of people's lives in science. So I just thought I'd ask.
I think it's important to make certain your social medias aligns with your professional image. I mean, maybe cat photos won't kill you, but if you have things that are inappropriate, pictures of parties or even other people, it's really important that that media, a lot of people I know are recommending my daughter before she applied for residencies, they told her to take down her social media. So what she did is she changed her name. So she didn't delete it. She just came up with a new name that's left out the Y, Perry. But any case, if you have it, either you could do that during that period. You don't want to create an image that's distracting from it. But I do think social media is important in creating a research image. And I think that extends beyond, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. It extends to things like ORCID and Scholar, Google Scholar, etc. All those things together create an image for you when people do a search, and they're going to do a search for you. Elaine was going to say something.
I think ResearchGate and LinkedIn are really good places to keep your stuff up to date. And LinkedIn is a place where you can be exclusively professional. And maybe I'm old fashioned, but when I only search for the people, when you're a reviewer, you get maybe 12 grants. So I'm only going to search for the people that I'm a primary reviewer for, whereas there might be 80 grants that are being discussed in my study section or my review group. But I'm not going to be searching for all of those people. So there are only going to be 3 people probably that search your media. And most of us, I think, ORCID, however you pronounce it, ORCID, that's incredibly important. You have to keep that up to date. That will be linked for the reviewer on the reviewer. When the reviewer is looking at your grant, that will be on their screen, that link. So you have to keep the ORCID up to date. And that has to be exclusively very targeted professionally. It's very rigorously managed what's allowed on ORCID. But I think when I do searches, I often come up with ResearchGate and LinkedIn, and I will look at those two, particularly when there's a grant that's on the edge. Like I want to give it a 2, but maybe it's a 3. And if it gets a 3, it won't be funded, but if it give it a 2, it will. And I'm debating with myself over that. And that's when the social media comes in for me as a reviewer. But I don't look at Facebook. I have a thing about Facebook. I think that
No, I know many people have this idea of Facebook is for cat pictures or something. But it actually, each one of them has a different marketing aspect. The one I tend to look the most at is Google Scholar. If people are registered, because it's a validated list of their publications with statistics about whether their career is going up or down.
Right.
I agree with populating all those sites like Google Scholar, because you can also see your H-index and citations over the years in ResearchGate, LinkedIn. I enjoy using Twitter as well and Instagram. I haven't used Facebook as much to promote my research, but that is something that I do if I remember to do it, to share those achievements. I think like social media is a great opportunity for you to showcase all the things that you've been working on, because when you do get an award, that's a huge accomplishment, and that deserves to be spread out into the public to kind of cement that as an accomplishment. So I think it's good to have those highlights in your career shared. And the other thing is having that personal website is good because that collates everything. So because all those awards and things that you post on social media will kind of be filtered down and like lost throughout because it's such a fast-paced environment, you do want to have like something to keep it all in one place. And that is just having a tab that says awards on your personal website. So then honestly, it's a CV for me to refer back to when I'm like populating my CV, because that one I know that I'm always updating it. And so when I'm actually updating my own CV, which is a Word document that keeps floating around and there's so many versions of it, I know that the one central one is the website one that I do remember to update more frequently. So that is a good system. I'm not sure about, because I haven't actually, when I guess I've never really reviewed like really big grants at my career stage. So I haven't actually taken the time to Google someone. I reviewed a grant for someone a few years ago, and I didn't think to Google them. But that was a few years ago. So I guess in this day and age, it would be like kind of like Elaine said, the deciding factor is if I'm like, kind of unsure of what grant to steer towards, then I could use their social media presence. The other thing is I often Google labs and check out their personal websites. And it feels like I get like a sense of what the lab is like and the lab environment, the culture, because they do have some fun events that they'll share. And I quite like that. And sort of that mentoring aspect of that lab. So I think that's a good way to showcase that it's a great lab environment. They do great research and they also have a fun environment, great mentoring. All the students are populated on the lab with information about where they are now. I've seen a lot of labs have little profiles and they'll say, and now they're currently here or something like that, which shows that there's continuity of that connection. And so I quite like that.
Elaine mentioned about ResearchGate. You can list all your awards on ResearchGate, and there's some other sites that have that. And Twitter, I didn't mention it earlier, there's also risk with Twitter trolls, which I only found out about recently, a few months ago. I did an interview for I think EndNotes or Stat, one of the two, that was critical of a company. Wow. I couldn't tell you what they said because it would be inappropriate, but it was pretty scathing. What they said about me. I wasn't the only one they said bad things, but there's just a lot of trolls on Twitter. And anyway.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I know there are some feuds on Twitter and things like that. Like there will be people who have will target a particular person who is quite well known in the field. So that can happen. So yeah, you do definitely have to be careful on Twitter because that kind of thing can easily happen. But it's actually, generally speaking, I would say that it's a great positive environment.
Oh,
where everyone,
no. I agree with you completely.
Yeah. But there is that
I'm actually very
random
concerned
thing that
about anything I post or say consequently is controversy. But what I wrote controversial was not even that. It was an interview for coverage of the biotech, but it sent the stock down. They interviewed me and the stock went down about $1 billion the next day. And so well, they were
You hold
guilty.
so
of-
much power.
Yeah.
No. It wasn't any power. I mean, the work, let's put it this way. Their scientific work was not exactly scientific.
Oh, I see.
Okay. And they asked me what I thought. And then when I was interviewed subsequently by the Wall Street Journal about the same thing, I didn't say hardly anything. So I wasn't quoted. And I was completely happy not to be quoted.
I've never had an attack through social media, but I've wondered, I've watched other people and I've wondered, how do you handle it? What do? Do you just ignore it? Do you answer it? Do you fight back? What do you do?
I called Stat right after, the guy who wrote the article. And he said, well, that's what they do. They have a lot of trolls out there and they go after people and they say, well, what do you do? And he said, I ignore it.
Yeah.
But I saw they again said something in Twitter anti-me, something misrepresented. And then I thought, should I correct it? And I just left it because then
Yeah, I think it's
you
hard
get them
to fight back.
activated.
Yeah, yeah. Well, those are all really good points. It's important to manage our social media. I have a lot of trouble with Twitter because I just want to be authentic, which means like millennial tweet every single thought I have, but some of my thoughts should not be shared with anyone else, because I'm human. So that's a good point, is that it's going to get back to you. Maybe a reviewer is going to see that tweet, or so that's a very, very fair point, that we got to keep it professional even in that personal.
Yeah, so kind of switching gears, I know trying to find funding opportunities might be a little overwhelming and you don't know where to start. So do you guys have any good tips or some maybe online resources that might list them?
There is a website by Johns Hopkins University. Yeah, so yeah, Staci agrees.
I was
This
going to
website,
mention that one. Yeah.
yeah, constantly gets updated, and it's like a really packed Excel spreadsheet at this point. So we'll link that in the chat. For eye research, the Association for Research in Vision and Ophthalmology, ARVO, they have their own funding guide. So that's great, and someone constantly updates that too. Yeah, so, and also just asking around people in your institute who are maybe a few years ahead of you, what have they been recently getting? And that can be a guide for what you could potentially apply for, because if it's within your institute, then it makes sense that, your institute is likely to be funded, for example, eye research projects and things like that. And since your institute has a success rate, that is something to kind of go for, and you can also ask them for examples of their proposals.
I'm glad you mentioned that list, because it kind of circles back to that very first question, funding opportunities for international students. I think you can filter on that Excel sheet. I think there's a column for citizenship requirements. I may be wrong on that, but I think you can filter out which ones you are eligible for and which ones you are not. And it's a very large list, so very, very helpful.
That would be the URL for that list should be on our blog. Let's make sure we have that on our blog. So
Yeah, I'll be including all of these. Corinn and I are taking turns writing all this down.
since you circled around to the funding, there was another funding possibility that I came across. I think it's still there. It's the Fogarty Foundation. And they fund people from outside the US to come into the US to work, as well as funding US citizens to go outside. There's also the
Fulbright, you're probably going to say, right?
Fulbright, yes, yes. And there's another one that starts with an F. Is it Frontiers?
No,
Human
Fulbright. I don't know if Frontiers funds fellows, do they?
Human Frontiers will give you $100,000 a year, and you
Okay.
can use that $100,000 a year. So it's a PI gets it, and they can use that $100,000 to support a foreign. They're supposed to have a collaboration with some other country.
Yes, no,
And Frontiers in Human.
yeah, no, I know
It's
the
not
program. I've applied
understand.
before.
I
I'm
have
not
but-
successfully get funded. But that's
One
not
of my
for
colleagues
junior, that's not for junior people though, right? That's
No,
to
the
fund
PI
them, but the PI is a senior person.
It funds foreign people to collaborate with US scientists. So it's Human
But
Frontiers
The
and Human.
Fulbright is a program that the US has with many countries throughout the world. And some are, depending on the country, it can be very competitive or not. And it funds people at all levels, For example, I had a Fulbright, I don't know, probably a decade ago. So it's for senior people, pre-docs, postdocs, faculty, both, and I think to travel both ways, but mostly for US people to go out.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Just remember, if you guys have any questions, type them in the chat. We're starting to get to the end of the session. So if you have any, we would love to have them answered. But another question Vic had and I had was, how personal should a personal statement be?
That's a really good question. So I'll just use myself as an example. So I do diabetes research, and in my personal statement or background statement or candidate statement, I detailed that I myself am living with type 1 diabetes, and I kind of put that out there because it does show some of my passion is personal. And so I think if the detail you want to share maybe helps your narrative, I would go ahead and share it. But if it doesn't help the narrative or related to your story, I'd probably keep it more on the professional end, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. That sounds like really solid advice. Do the other panelists want to weigh in on?
I had a student apply last year from our program that I was mentoring, and she's very creative, very, very creative. And she has like a double major in the arts as an undergrad, and she's a graduate student now. And so she wanted to do a statement that talked about how her great creativity could be brought to bear in her science work. But she's tried twice to get an F31, and the first time the reviewers came back and said, we don't want creativity of your sort in science. So that was very hurtful. And then I said, well, if you're going to write this again, you have to specifically say how your creativity will enhance your science specifically, not just say, I'm so creative, I'm going to do cool stuff. So she managed to rework it, and she didn't get it, but she got a much better score. And she got feedback about how exciting her creativity would be were she bringing it to science. So it really depends on how you explain what you're doing. And Staci had exactly the right thing. It shows your passion for the project. And so if her creativity shows an ability that she can bring to the science, that's great. But if her creativity is just something she paints at night, it doesn't help her case. I don't know if you guys saw this article it was in the New York Times sometime earlier this week, maybe last week. There was an article in the Times about whether to bring your whole self to work or not. Did some of you read that? I thought that was really interesting, because in my lab, we generally bring our whole selves to the lab. I mean, we all know if somebody has a sick child at home and has to stay home, we know that nowadays. I was a mother of 2 when I was a postdoc, and I never let anybody know if my kids were sick, because the discrimination against mothers was really rugged. But that's not the case anymore. So I think you can let most of yourself show, but not everything. And I think it's important not to burden your work environment with disruptions that you're going through. So having a balance on that is the same thing for writing your personal statement. You want to feature the things that will make you want to be personal. You want to show them that you're being authentic, I think is the word somebody used. You want to show them that you're being transparent, but you're not going to hang out your laundry, your underwear. You're not going to show things that might undermine your case. So that is a narrow line to tread. But it's really important, because a lot of these reviewers take the personal statement very seriously. They want to know, how committed are you to this career? because they don't want to fund somebody who's going to go out and be a hairdresser or be a flight attendant or do gardening. They want to fund somebody who will stick with it and be committed and persevere.
Yeah, I agree very much with what Elaine said. When I look at these for the NSF grants, I look at how what they've done fits into the future, what their likelihood to stay with some type of career, not necessarily an academic one, but one that's related to science. And you look for documentation of it, either in their personal life or their accomplishments.
I would agree to add that personal touch to the personal statement, because that makes it more you, in the sense that it's not like a generic thing that you copied from the internet and it was a template, because I feel like sometimes they can read like that. And so by putting that touch of like your own personality into it, it makes it more genuine, and it makes it more interesting as well to the reader, because you're learning more about this person is applying, and you're learning about how like these decisions of applying will shape their career, and yeah, like George said, like where they're going to take their career into the future, because at the end of the day, if you do have like a really generic one, I think it's also not as fun to read. And it's more engaging to learn more about the person, sort of like a plot, a novel where it's more character driven and you're learning more about the protagonist. So I think if you make it seem like you're the protagonist of the story, then it makes it more fun.
And if they can identify with your success as their success, they can become an advocate for you. And having an advocate in the study section of the reviewer is pretty important. Elaine is smiling. My view is if you don't have an advocate, you're doomed. No, I think pretty close. That they have to read your proposal and have to, especially if they're rating, if it's only the top 10% or less that are going to be funded. There's so many good proposals. You have to grab them, either with the science you're doing or something about your career that they realize you should rise to the top among a lot of other good people. You know, if they're funding 50%, then you can do things based on the numbers. And all it takes is one negative thing that somebody can point out to be eliminated. So that's why it's good to get opinion of other people who can say, don't say that. Don't mention that. Because that's all it takes is one thing to be harpooned.
I agree with you totally, George. My no was doomed. Yes, doomed. You are doomed. And so what we're talking about is how to connect to the reviewers. Well, one thing that's a piece of information that's really useful is to look on the NIH website to find the roster and find out who are the scientists who are going to be in that committee, and see if there are any who have an overlapping interest with what you're planning. And if there are people who have an overlapping interest in what you're planning, they're likely to be the top 3 reviewers of your grant. And if you know their work and you write a grant that is ignorant of them, they will not like it. So if you want to connect to the reviewers, I have a friend who is a permanent member of a study section, and she says she looks to see if her work has been cited in the literature cited, and if her work isn't there, she downgrades the grant. She doesn't even really read them well if her work isn't there. So there are some reviewers like that. I'm not like that, but I do look, if it overlaps with my work, I do look and see, are they citing me? Are they aware of what I'm doing? So get a hold of the roster, it's posted, and find out if there's anybody on it who overlaps interests. And then that's a person who can either doom you or you can connect with. And if you connect with somebody, you get a champion.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned this about looking, whether it's even whether they understand my work. I usually look, one of the things is what papers do they reference?
Right.
And I use it not just to, about my own, that would be one piece. But the bigger piece is, it's a reflection of whether they understand the field.
Right.
And it's easier for me to look at that list than to read the whole text. So I get, that would be, I look at the title, the abstract, and then I'd probably look at the and the specific aims, and then I would look at the list of references. And if the references didn't fit, it'd be doomed. I would just think of how I'm going to fill up the page so I can make sure it doesn't get funded. It's clear they don't have a good alignment.
Right.
Remember, most of the grants you're basically trying to reject. So you need to figure, you have to give them all the ammunition to make none of the mistakes so they can move you to the top and get excited. And for me, that usually happens within first 2 to 3 minutes of looking at a grant.
Right.
I'm sure Elaine is the same, right? You look at a few pieces and you reach, and then sometimes you change your mind. It does happen probably 10% of the time. But most of the time, the first bits are where you create your advocacy or doomed.
The other thing I look at is the figures. I might not read all the text, and I get cross-eyed when I've got 12 grants, and especially when I'm doing R1s with 12 pages that is tightly spaced. I look at the figures and I look at whether the thing looks feasible. And if it doesn't look feasible from the figures, it's doomed as far as I'm concerned. I don't look at whether they've actually done the experiments that they're proposing to do. I look at whether those experiments are possible in their hands.
Well, I would like to thank all the panelists for all their great advice today, and thank you for the audience for coming. I hope it was helpful. Just as a reminder, all this information will be put in a blog post soon, and to get updates, you can follow at ASIP Path on Twitter. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Meet you all. Nice to see you again, George and Diane.
Yes, it's great to see you again, Elaine.
Bye, everyone.